pardon me, I just, as I go through and do this, that if I touch on things and if they don't apply, I erred on the side of sharing them with you. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my presentation? Is that sharing?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, perfect. Great. Let me see if I can try to get the comments to view so I can see those as well. And so the first thing I wanted to go over is, let me just open the chat here so I can see if people have comments. Again, I want this to kind of be informative to you. I have some things I'm going to go through, but please feel free to ask questions, clarify when you need to. I want this to be beneficial to you. So the first area that I want to start in is kind of why does the Office for Academic Personnel exist? And it exists because of the collective bargaining agreements. As all of you likely know, the faculty are unionized. Hopefully that doesn't come to shock to anyone. And that effective July 1, we entered into, there are 2 collective bargaining agreements were ratified, Unit 1 and Unit 2. They're in effect from July 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2024. And I'll go over what the differences are between those two units. But with that said, while they are in place for 3 years, either party can open negotiations on the compensation article at any time, which has impact for your work. Or excuse me, not at any time, on a yearly basis. And then in addition, we're always under the Public Employees Bargaining Act, we're kind of always required to engage in bargaining when instances of that are bargainable apply. So for example, an example of this is with all of these COVID protocols and the vaccine mandate that was recently implemented several months ago. Well, that's an administrative policy or procedure, which is our discretion to do. The union can request impact bargaining about the impact of implementation of that. So that's an example of where we would bargain outside of the development of the contract, so which we have engaged in. So those are examples of kind of ongoing bargaining that we do. But as a result of those agreements, it has necessitated the formation of the Office for Academic Personnel, because one of our primary focuses is the implementation of the collective bargaining agreements and the administration of that. It's not our only purview, but it's a large thrust of what we do. And it also is what makes it the purview of the office different than what has existed in prior iterations in the past, whether it's the Office for Faculty Affairs and Services. I worked in these offices before, so I should know what their names are, faculty contracts, the various iterations. The implementation of the collective bargaining makes our work very different. In addition, one of the other things that makes our work very different is which you've likely experienced in your role, is that we've engaged in a shared service agreement with human resources to do our transactional processing. So we've eliminated that responsibility from my office, and which means we can focus on other items that have broader impact that are not just transactional processing. There's such a huge volume of it. It's where our work kind of got stuck in that focus, but this allows us to focus on more higher level substantive issues, collective bargaining agreement implementation, that kind of thing. So sorry, let me move forward. So that was why the Office for Academic Personnel was formulated. Kind of as I said, we're going to be a home base of support for partnering with university leaders and academic administrators to implement faculty policies and procedures that impact faculty personnel, to effectuate them. We support the recruitment and advancement and retention of our faculty. So hiring processes still come through my office. Policy interpretation application is largely what we're going to continue to do in compliance with the CBA. This is a focus of our office. Now, I am the director of the office. However, we are in process of hiring our new staff, or our staffing up We didn't really have any staff, like a month ago. So currently our staff is going to be made up of, we have recently hired a labor and employee relations specialist. Her name is Kate Davis. Hopefully she's here. I haven't seen her scrolling through in the list of people, but I'm also not looking at everyone. So she's our labor and employee relations specialist. So she's our specialist to be kind of the higher level point of contact to really help us develop these implementation procedures, to beef up our internal protocols, serve as that higher level point of contact for departments, for yourself. And in addition, we're hiring 2 HR analysts to be that primary point of contact to manage the email, manage the intake of requests, walk-ins, phone, manage our reporting obligations that we have under the collective bargaining agreement, and we're in process of filling those 2 positions. Iris Gutierrez, our consultant, is actually leaving us at today's her last day. So we're very sad to be losing Iris, but she's moving on to a better opportunity for her. So we're very happy for her as well. But so Iris will be transitioning out, and to have myself, director, specialist, and 2 analysts. What the office will be made up on. So a little bit different makeup than before. Here's our contact information. We're still in the same place as OFAS or faculty contracts. We're still the same contact information. So please feel free to reach out to us. One of the things that we are doing, which you've likely experienced with the shared services for with HR, is that HR has taken, because of when the office was for OFAS was disbanded, it kind of created a vacuum, because there was really no staff left to help support the functions that needed to continue. And HR did step in to that role. And so they've kind of played a more front and center role that we're hoping to walk back now that we are staffing the office, so that we're your primary point of contact and that we would be more of the interface with human resources. So hopefully that addresses some confusion or as to who you're working with and who you should be addressing questions to, that we've recognized that that's an issue as we've develop, or as we're rolling out the Office for Academic Personnel. So look for a change there as well. So to kind of go over, so again, what I want to focus today are 2 things. One is to implement the aspects of the collective bargaining agreement that impact the research arena, and then plus another item, which is the institutional based salary, which is probably the one you guys are all very interested in as well. But to give you some context for the collective bargaining agreement, when we entered the bargaining session for those collective bargaining agreements, our concerns were transparency, accountability, and equity. Those were the purviews we went into the bargaining table with. UNM's concerns are, they had a lot of concerns about part-time instructors, which doesn't really necessarily apply to this group, so I'm not really going to focus on them much. But they, in addition to sharing those concerns that the administration had, they had a lot for concerns with our unit with our adjunct faculty. But again, I'm not going to focus really on them very much at all, because I don't think it applies very often to the not as applicable to the research arena. So we have 2, just to make sure everyone knows, and I apologize if this seems very basic, but again, I just kind of want to start from like first principles, just to make sure everyone understands what we have with our collective bargaining agreements. We have, I think someone just maybe needs to mute. Alana, I think maybe you became unmuted. That we have 2 collective bargaining agreements. We have a Unit 1 and a Unit 2. Unit 1 is your regular faculty. I'm going to go over who makes up that unit in a minute. And that's where we're going to focus today. We're going to focus on the provisions of Unit 1 because that's what's most applicable in the research arena. Unit 2 is our adjunct faculty, adjunct and term teachers. Not that they're not applicable to the work that you do, but I'm just not going to focus on them there. If you happen to have a question, let me know. I'm happy to answer. But again, what we're going to focus on are the provisions in the Unit 1 collective bargaining agreement. But then in addition to the CBAs, we have other documents that guide our work with the unions. We have memos of understanding or memos of agreement, and we also have joint communications. One just went out a couple of minutes ago. And so about when I mentioned impact bargaining, and a joint communication just went out, and you'll find all of these communications on the provost website and all these documents on the provost website. I recommend bookmarking it, being familiar, because we'll refer to it all the time. So again, living in unit 1 collective bargaining agreement, and I've referenced the article numbers here just for your reference, so hopefully that you find that helpful, so you know where I'm referencing as I go through and talk about these provisions. But the Article 2 union recognition is what identifies who is covered by the union. And so in addition to our regular faculty, tenure track lecturers, faculty, it also includes research faculty. Our research faculty are represented by the union. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone. And the titles that are included are those listed there: research professor, research associate professor, assistant professor, and our research lecturer series. It excludes research scholar. It excludes visiting faculty. Sometimes we do have visiting research faculty, just to keep that in mind. And then it also excludes postdocs. So for those groups, so it's important to know who we're working with and what rules apply to them. When we're talking about our union covered faculty, this is the order in which we apply our rules or policies: our collective bargaining agreement, faculty handbook, and then administrative policy is the order in which we apply them. And then finally policies or procedures guidelines are the lowest level. But we always start with the collective bargaining agreement for those represented faculty. But if we're talking about research scholars, postdocs, or visiting faculty, those are governed by the faculty handbook. Okay. So another important article to keep in mind as we're going through and managing especially our research or our faculty in general, is management rights and what the contract allows us to do. This is an incredibly important provision. You know, part of what becomes hard for people who are administering to the employment needs of the faculty are like, you'll hear a lot, well, the union said this, or I'm going to go to the union with this, I'm going to go to the union with that. And they can do that. That's their right. Faculty can do that. The union can represent. Those things are fine, but there are limits on it. And management actually has a lot of rights. There are things that we can do that are not grievable, for which we can take action on. Specifically, we can determine the mission of the university. Again, these may seem kind of like straightforward or basic, but they are incredibly important, and we run into this all the time. So I do want to go over what are our management rights. So to determine the mission of the university, its schools, departments, and programs, to set standards and qualifications and performance expectations. So that's a really important one. The standards, qualifications, and performance expectations, that's the management of people. Exercise control and discretion over university organization, operations, property, equipment, and facilities. Direct bargaining unit members, that's the supervision. Transfer, assign, promote, grant tenure, retain members, suspend, discharge, or take other disciplinary action. Now, there are collective bargaining agreements, articles, and policies that do dictate how we do these things, but what this is saying is it's administration's or management's decision to make it's within our authority to make these decisions. We're to have authority to relieve faculty members from duties because lack of work, decrease in enrollment, programmatic changes, or other administrative reasons, to maintain efficiency of operations, determine methods, means, and personnel, including contracting of services, promulgate or amend any other policies, rules, regulations, directives, or orders. That's also, well, that maybe seems super basic as well. That's also another incredibly important provision that allows us to implement policies that is within the university's authority to do. Though that may result in some bargaining, but we have the authority to implement policies or rules or regulations that we feel are best needed to manage our operation, and also to take whatever actions necessary to carry out the function and mission of the university and departments, programs, etc. So those are the management rights. Now, to get more in kind of the nitty gritty of the articles that we actually apply on a day-to-day basis, our important one is Article 7, which you've already been living with through the MSU process. So this may seem not quite as timely, but there are a couple of things I wanted to point out in this article. So it's Article 7, which deals with compensation. One, as you know, effective July 1, faculty got a 1.5% increase. It's important, I mentioned before when I kind of talked about the very basic overview of the collective bargaining agreements that are in place for 3 years, but the compensation article can be opened annually. That's what allows for these annual MSU increases. So again, just be mindful as we go through this process next year, depending on what, the financial climate is, that just like you have seen for staff, where you get like MSU guidelines for non-bargaining staff, and then then the bargaining unit ones roll out as the agreements with the unions are finalized. We'll also see that for faculty because we have to engage in bargaining on that issue. So we had the 1.5% increase, but then there were also provisions that allowed research faculty to give increased at administration's discretion, increases, give more than 1.5% if their funding allowed. Also, there are provisions that allowed for equity, merit, retention, and counter offers. Merit is a relatively new clarification. We just issued, again, an MOU or MOA, excuse me, memo of agreement that clarified that merit is within our ability, merit increases are within our authority to grant as well. And so those are also allowed in the collective bargaining agreement. Those increases are effectuated in a couple of ways. They're effectuated primarily through the annual MSU process. And they're also effectuated via the compensation change requests. And the thing to keep in mind, especially if we're talking about research faculty, that provision that I've cited there, the research faculty can petition, is actually quite broad and gives us a lot of latitude to make decisions, though that we have to be, they have to be based on, what's allowed in the funding and fairness and equity and those kinds of things. So they do allow us flexibility to give increases to our research faculty. And then that provision about equity, merit, retention, counter offers, which is actually multiple provisions within that article, is also actually relatively broad in its application. So it does allow us to give increases to our regular faculty as well. So that's primarily with the compensation article. There's other provisions in the article which apply to more to the regular faculty, like promotional increases and minimum salary thresholds. I'm not going to cover them here unless someone has a question they want to ask about them, because I didn't think they were totally applicable to this group for this purpose that we've come here today. But again, this article has more information than this, what I've distilled it down to. But those are the highlights for this group. Also, leave. The Unit 1 collective bargaining agreement has provisions on leave. Many of these, specifically annual leave, sick leave, are the same, similar, almost identical to the faculty handbook articles that existed previously or continue to exist. So there's no real change there. For sick leave, it did kind of codify the practice we've been implementing in terms of prorating sick leave. So I just want to mention that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because this really isn't a change. But there are some elements in the leave that are a change. One is parental leave. And this has already come up as an issue. Under the faculty handbook, parental leave is limited to regular contract staff of 50% FTE, I believe, or greater. Regular contract staff. That typically does not mean research faculty. Under the article, it just says bargaining unit members, which does include research faculty. So that is a change. However, what the provision allows, it's important to understand what parental leave is, because I understand that may be a conflict with what their funding allows, that sometimes the funding agency doesn't allow for an extended leave, paid leave, for example. But so here's what things to keep in mind. Well, now the eligibility has been broadened. There are other provisions in the parental leave policy or contract article to be aware of. One is that it's broader. Two, this is not a change, but just to point it out, is that the intent of parental leave is that it's a release from teaching duties. Research and service are expected to continue. So research faculty are predominantly research, right? That their duties under the spirit and language of the article are intended to continue. It's up to the dean has the prerogative to establish guidelines for relief, meaning release of duties under parental leave. And also the plan that's developed for the leave must consider impact to students, grantors, patients and other beneficiaries of the program. And that's where, the issue of does the granting agency allow it or funding agency allow it or not come in. And so while it is broader, there are still these provisions wanted to highlight. So again, if you find yourself having to address these issues with a research faculty member, bring them to your college administrator's attention, bring them to my attention so we can work through the particulars of that case. Some other changes are bereavement leave, appointment of 50% or more paid leave for up to 3 working days. Now, bereavement leave is also limited. It's not just any death in their family member. It has to meet the certain criteria. But it's, again, very similar to if you're, especially the staff policy, if you're familiar with the staff policy, very similar. Research leave. Tenure track faculty, so during their probationary period, are eligible to provide a teaching release prior to tenure review, minimum of 2 courses, release from teaching of a semester, or multiple course releases over a series of semesters dependent on college department or policy. If you happen to be in arts and sciences, you already had this practice. This was already an established practice in arts and sciences, but which has now been adopted. Their kind of model for the university has been adopted in the collective bargaining agreement. Sorry, I moved my mouse and I'm off my screen where I'm controlling moving forward. So moving forward on leaves, academic leave, which had previously been for principal lecturers only, is now applies to senior lecturers. Research leave is there twice, I guess. So those are the major highlights of the leave articles. Workload, now workload, I did want to touch on it because this is a major thrust of what we're doing, what the work departments are doing regarding collective bargaining agreement implementation at the moment. Under Article 13 departments. Now, this may seem also a little bit, depending on where you work, like why do we need to do this? But not every, believe it or not every department had a workload policy, or not every college or school had an overarching workload policy. And so it was very confusing for faculty working in those areas to know exactly what their, especially their teaching expectations are, but their overall workload expectations. So under the contract, they're required, each department is required to have a published workload policy. Now we're working with UAUNM to clarify what the timeline was for doing this. And so, but the work starts now. The departments are supposed to be engaging in this conversations now, but they need to have a published workload policy, which establish expectations for teaching, research, and service. It's intended to define approved reasons for course releases. That includes like buyout provisions. Many colleges already have buyout policies, but that may be something that's looked at as we go through this process. Annual review and approval of workload expectations for each part. They're required to review it annually with the faculty member. Now, this isn't intended to be an additional annual review with the faculty member. It's supposed to be incorporated, and we recommend incorporating it into their normal annual review process, but it needs to include a review of workload. Accounting for workload can be on a 100-point scale. It's to address all types of faculty, including research faculty too, so are intended to be addressed in the workload policy. None of these things aren't new, but it's just to go over what the provisions of the contract. Standard workload components are instruction, research, service. And what I mentioned, it needs to consider what is appropriate for course releases. It should also consider how external funding for grants, consider external grant funding, how that relates to course releases. Again, many colleges have buyout policies that are already in place, but again, those may be reviewed or reconsidered or thought through as we engage in this process. Again, it does allow for discipline-specific workload policies, which already exist. Hard sciences may have very different, departments may have very different teaching loads than, humanities say. Those things, discipline-specific differences are expected, and the contract allows for it. So those are really the highlights based on my reading of the provisions of the Unit 1 collective bargaining agreement that I think are appropriate for this audience for the purpose we're here today. The other kind of thing I would leave you with is this is new to all of us. As we implement, get used to working with a unionized faculty, with as we're implementing these things, in some cases for the first time, interpreting the contract for the first time, just be aware of when you're in of a couple of things. One, if you're approached by a union representative for information or potentially for a grievance, reach out to me, work through your college administrator, or work through your college administrator where they can reach out to me, so we can ensure that what they're asking for is appropriate and we provide it in the appropriate means. You know, it is very natural and appropriate to share information with the union, but we need to make sure we're doing that consistently, documenting what we're doing. And sometimes people kind of get their hackles up because they're not sure of what to do in that case. And I think the first step is, if you're approached for information or for like somebody saying the word grievance or something to that effect, reach out to me and we'll work through it. To also understand when you're in application or interpretation of the contract. A good example of that is the research, the application of parental leave for research faculty. That was an issue that I think it was School of Engineering had a situation that was brought to our attention, and we reviewed and interpreted the contract article. And that's why I highlighted some of those provisions today. And so what's important, especially as we're doing this for the first time often in many cases, since it's so new, when we start to interpret what the meaning of the statements that are maybe unclear are in the contract, well, you maybe think you're doing that for your specific situation or departments that you're dealing with at the time. It actually has implications to the broader university. So feel free to reach out. We want to discuss. We want to help you do that. And then we're also kind of tracking and making note of how we're interpreting things so we can have a consistent application moving forward. And again, when in doubt, just call. We're happy to help. And even at, things that we think are seemingly simple, we find, again, School of Engineering is really good at finding these things, find a couple of issues where we're like, actually, you thought this was a simple answer, but it turns out when you actually read the detail or put the applicable articles together, it's actually quite complicated and we have to interpret. So please do that. So those are all the articles of the collective bargaining agreement that I wanted to go over today. The other item I wanted to talk about, which is probably what everyone is really most interested in, is institutional base salary. My understanding is when I was not in this role at the time, so again, if I misstate something, please let me know, is that when we rolled out the summer research guidelines for this past summer, there were some concern or issues were raised about what components of a faculty member's salary are appropriate to include in summer research. And it's my understanding that during that process, notice was given to the campus community that the standards that we had used previously are changing, and the development or recognition or documentation of what makes an institution-based salary was developed, which is, just to read it here, this is again published on the Office for Academic Personnel's website. Institutional base salary is the annual compensation paid by the University of New Mexico to an individual faculty member's appointment, whether for all components of their work, teaching, research, or service, or other activities as defined by their workload. It's set by their offer letter. Institutional base salary is used as a basis to determine summer research payments. It can be found, so it is the base salary that is quoted to them in their contract. They can find it on their contract summary page. It's important to keep in mind what it excludes. My understanding of when the summer research guidelines were rolled out in March-ish of this year, right? I can't quite keep track of where I am in time. That notice was given that these changes that I'm about to discuss would be applicable this upcoming cycle, but want to make sure, our partners in Officer Sponsored Project has been very clear that we need to make sure we're communicating this well. So this is as we're starting to continue the notice that we started earlier this year. Institutional base salary excludes special administrative components, the plus component of any base plus compensation arrangement. Now, the only places where that should live are Arts and Sciences and School of Engineering. There are not many faculty who have that, but there are some. And so it excludes the plus component. Now, the thing to keep in mind with that is that the plus, it's very hard for us, like me, to identify what that is because it just looks like in reports or things, their base salary. And so it's really incumbent on departments and colleges to track who is on these arrangements and what their underlying 9-month base salary is and what the plus component is. It excludes extra compensation as defined by Faculty Handbook C-140, any outside income or income from outside employment, honoraria, consulting fees, those kind of things are excluded. While we did start these conversations and informing the campus community last March-ish, I believe, we're also going to be continuing to do that. And one of the things, ways we're going to do that, in addition to things like this, is by issuing those summer research guidelines early. I'm hoping that we'll get them out based on the feedback our friends at OSP have said in December, so months earlier. Now the forms that support the process are likely not to be rolled out at that period of time, but at least getting the guidelines out so you guys can plan, budget, grants, proposals, applications, budget appropriately. So we hope to issue that earlier this year. So those are the items that I have anticipated going over. I wanted to leave some time for question and answer. I don't see any, so if folks want to have, if you have any questions about what I've talked about today or any other items, please feel free to ask that apply to the Office for Academic Personnel. Please feel free to chime in or you can feel free to just speak up or you can ask them in the chat.
Emily, I don't have a question. I just want to thank you. This is Michelle Casillas from OSP.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi. Yes, thank you for the information, especially on the first part of the presentation as it relates to the collective bargaining agreements. It's helpful to know this information even at high level, just so that we are aware of some of the provisions that might impact the faculty that are applying for research grants or contracts. So again, I want to thank you. As it relates to one thing that you said, the workload policy, I think there's a buyout provision, and that as it stands, it's going to be pretty much consistent with what it's been, right?
Most likely, yeah. I would be surprised if it were to change. I just point that out because with the work that departments are supposed to, or departments, schools and colleges are engaging in on workload policy, they're supposed to be looking at these things. So there's the potential it could change, but I would not anticipate it changing.
Okay, and you did mention that some individual colleges, and maybe I misunderstood, they've adopted their own their own rules around this. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding that?
Regarding buyout specifically?
Buyout.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, so the information we get from, so again, a lot of this lives in the college level, so I don't have the individual information, but as we work with our colleges and schools on various issues that come up, they often refer to their buyout policy. And I don't know, because these things live in the college and schools, if those really if they're consistent across college and schools, or if they vary. I would suspect they're relatively consistent, but I don't know that. But often it's at that level where that type of information lives. And so, for example, I don't know if School of Engineering's buyout amount percentage is the same as Arts and Sciences. I don't know that.
And that's just helpful. Again, it's helpful information for our office, to know, so that we can kind of anticipate how it might need to be handled differently for each college. So thank you.
Great.